People always tell you to stay away from the scary kid, but no one ever asks why he spends every afternoon standing alone. That was the sentence I kept repeating to myself long before I finally understood the truth about Mason Brooks. If you had walked through the front gates of Westbrook High that fall, you would have heard his name whispered the same way people talked about abandoned houses or dark roads at night. Nobody claimed to know what he had actually done, yet somehow everyone had a story. Some said he'd been expelled from another school. Others insisted he'd been suspended for getting into trouble. Freshmen lowered their voices whenever he passed. Seniors pretended not to notice him, but their eyes always followed him down the hallway. Teachers rarely called on him, and even the loudest kids seemed to grow quiet whenever he entered a classroom. Mason never argued with the rumors. He never defended himself. He simply carried his backpack over one shoulder, sat in the last row by the window, finished every assignment without complaint, and disappeared before anyone could start a conversation. I wasn't brave. I wasn't popular either. I was just Ethan Carter, the kind of student teachers described as dependable and classmates forgot 5 minutes after attendance ended. My world revolved around quizzes, library books, and the small coffee shop where I worked a few evenings each week. I preferred quiet places because they made life easier to understand. People were predictable there. Mason wasn't. The first time I really noticed him wasn't because of the rumors. It was because he was staring out the classroom window while rain slid down the glass in silver lines. His expression wasn't angry or threatening. It looked lonely. That single moment stayed with me for reasons I couldn't explain. Still, I pushed the thought away like everyone else did. Until the Tuesday, everything changed. The final bell echoed through the building just after 3 o'clock, and students poured into the parking lot in noisy groups. I adjusted my backpack, slipped my headphones over my ears, and started my usual 20-minute walk home. Halfway down Maple Street, I felt something strange. Not danger, just the unmistakable feeling that someone was behind me. I glanced over my shoulder. About 30 feet away, walking at an unhurried pace with his hands tucked into the pockets of his dark hoodie, was Mason Brooks. I looked forward again, telling myself it was a coincidence. We lived in the same town. Plenty of people used this sidewalk. But when I crossed the street, he crossed too. When I stopped at the crosswalk, he stopped several steps behind me. My pulse quickened, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because every rumor I'd ever heard suddenly rushed back into my head. The traffic light changed. I kept walking without looking back again until I reached my neighborhood. Only then did I turn around. Mason had stopped beneath an old maple tree at the corner. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He simply waited until I unlocked my front door. The second I stepped safely inside, he turned around and quietly walked away. The next afternoon, I told myself I had imagined everything. People accidentally walked the same route home every day. It was a public sidewalk, not some mysterious coincidence waiting to become a story. Still, when the final bell rang, I found myself glancing toward the last row before I even packed my books. Mason's desk was already empty. Somehow that disappointed me more than it should have. I laughed at myself, zipped my backpack, and headed outside with the rest of the afternoon crowd. The September air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass from the football field, and golden sunlight stretched long shadows across the campus. Students gathered around cars, laughed over weekend plans, and hurried toward buses. Everything looked completely normal until I reached the front gate. He was there, standing beside the old brick wall with both hands in his pockets. Mason looked toward the street instead of the school. He did not search for me. He did not call my name. It almost seemed as though he had been waiting for someone else. I slowed my pace without meaning to. As I passed him, he quietly fell into steps several yards behind me. Not close enough to make me uncomfortable. Not far enough to disappear. The distance remained exactly the same no matter how many turns I made. My curiosity finally outweighed my anxiety. Halfway home, I stopped outside a small convenience store and pretended to check my phone through the front window. Mason kept walking until he reached the next corner, then stopped beneath a traffic sign without looking back. He simply waited. The moment I started walking again, he did the same. It happened again on Wednesday. And Thursday. By Friday, I had stopped wondering whether it was an accident. It was not. It had become a routine so strangely consistent that I began noticing details I had missed before. Mason never looked at his phone. He never wore headphones. He never seemed distracted by anything around him. Every afternoon he appeared outside the school within minutes of the final bell, followed the same route at the same quiet pace, and disappeared only after I stepped through my front door. He never crossed the invisible line between watching and approaching. At school, nothing changed. We never spoke. During chemistry class, he answered every question correctly without showing any pride. During lunch, he sat alone beneath the oak tree near the baseball field while everyone else crowded into noisy groups. Once I noticed a sophomore accidentally drop a stack of notebooks near the hallway lockers. Before anyone else reacted, Mason bent down, gathered every notebook, handed them back with a polite nod, and continued walking without waiting for thanks. The younger student looked stunned, as if kindness had come from the last person he expected. Yet by the next class period, the familiar whispers returned, swallowing that small moment as though it had never happened. Rumors, I realized, were louder than quiet actions. That evening, while helping an elderly customer carry groceries to her car outside the neighborhood market, I caught sight of a familiar dark hoodie across the parking lot. Mason stood beside the bus stop with a paper bag in one hand, patiently waiting as an older woman slowly climbed onto the city bus ahead of him. He offered his arm to steady her, smiled so briefly that I almost thought I imagined it, and stepped back without expecting recognition. The bus pulled away, and for the first time since all of this had begun, I asked myself a question that refused to leave my mind. What if the person everyone feared was hiding from something instead of threatening anyone at all? By the second week, I realized I was no longer the only one paying attention. High school had a way of turning the smallest mystery into the biggest conversation, and whatever was happening between Mason and me had become impossible to hide. It started with harmless questions. One of my classmates leaned across the history table and casually asked whether Mason lived near my neighborhood. Another joked that I had somehow become the only person the quiet giant tolerated. By Friday, the whispers had transformed into elaborate stories that grew stranger every time they changed hands. Someone claimed Mason had threatened another student years ago. Someone else insisted he was watching me because of an old family disagreement. None of them had evidence. They only had confidence, and confidence was often mistaken for truth. My best friend, Noah Bennett, cornered me outside the cafeteria before lunch. His expression carried the same mixture of concern and disbelief I had seen on everyone else's face all week. "Tell me you are not walking home alone anymore," he said. I tried to laugh it off, but Noah did not smile. He explained that several students had noticed Mason waiting outside the school every afternoon. Even teachers had begun exchanging quiet looks whenever dismissal approached. "You have to tell someone if he is bothering you," Noah insisted. "You do not owe anybody silence just because they never actually say anything." I wanted to agree with him. Instead, I heard myself answering with a sentence that surprised even me. "He has never done anything wrong." Noah stared at me for several seconds before shaking his head. That is exactly what makes this so strange. His words stayed with me throughout the day. During English class, I found myself looking toward the last row again. Mason was focused on the novel resting open on his desk, listening carefully while our teacher discussed symbolism. When another student struggled to answer a question, Mason quietly raised his hand only after several awkward moments had passed. His explanation was thoughtful, respectful, and surprisingly insightful. The teacher thanked him with genuine appreciation, yet the room fell silent in a way that had nothing to do with literature. It was almost as though everyone had forgotten he was capable of sounding gentle. After class, I deliberately slowed my pace as students poured into the hallway. I wanted to see where Mason went between classes. Instead of joining the crowded corridors, he climbed the stairs toward the library. Curiosity pulled me after him from a distance. Through the glass doors, I watched him return 3 books to the front desk before helping the librarian lift a heavy box of donated novels onto a cart. She smiled warmly and thanked him by name. Mason nodded with the same quiet politeness I had seen at the bus stop and left without lingering. The librarian waved after him as if this happened every week. I stood frozen behind a bookshelf, confused by how different this scene looked from the person everyone had described. If he was truly the frightening student people claimed he was, why did the librarian greet him like an old friend? Why did younger students occasionally smile when they thought no one else was looking? Why had I never once seen the version of Mason everyone else seemed convinced existed? That afternoon, as always, he waited near the front gate. I walked home with the familiar footsteps remaining several yards behind me, but something had changed inside my own mind. For the first time, I stopped wondering why Mason was following me and started wondering why everyone else seemed determined to follow a story that no longer made any sense. The questions followed me everywhere after that. They lingered in the hallway between classes, floated across cafeteria tables, and somehow always found their way into conversations that had nothing to do with me. It was as if everyone wanted me to confirm the version of Mason they had already decided was true. Instead, I kept remembering the librarian's smile, the elderly woman at the bus stop, and the quiet patience that never matched the frightening image everyone else described. The contradiction refused to leave my mind. Friday afternoon, my manager at the coffee shop asked if I could cover an extra shift because another employee had called in sick. I agreed without thinking. The evening rush stretched longer than expected, and by the time I locked the front door, the sky had already turned deep blue. The streets were unusually calm as I began the 15-minute walk home. I assumed Mason would not be anywhere nearby. School had ended hours ago, and whatever strange routine had connected our afternoons surely ended at the front gate. Yet as I passed the small neighborhood pharmacy, I caught sight of a familiar figure across the street. Mason stepped out carrying 2 paper grocery bags filled with canned soup, bread, bottled water, and what looked like medicine from the pharmacy next door. Instinctively, I slowed my pace. He never noticed me. Instead of heading toward the newer neighborhoods where many students lived, he continued into the oldest part of town, where narrow streets wound between weathered houses that had stood for decades. I hesitated only a moment before quietly following at a respectful distance. Curiosity had become stronger than caution. Mason finally stopped in front of a modest white house with peeling paint and an overgrown flower garden. He carefully balanced the grocery bags against the porch railing before unlocking the front door. Through the living room window, I saw an elderly woman waiting in a wheelchair near the entrance. The moment Mason stepped inside, her entire face brightened. He smiled back with a warmth I had never seen at school. It completely transformed him. He knelt beside her chair, spoke softly, and handed her the small pharmacy bag first. She reached out, gently brushed his hair away from his forehead, and laughed at something he said. Even through the closed window, I could recognize the easy comfort between them. There was nothing forced about it, nothing guarded. It was simply home. I stood across the street feeling strangely guilty, as though I had wandered into a private chapter of someone else's life. Before I could quietly leave, the front door opened again. Mason carried a large trash bag to the curb, followed by an older neighbor struggling with several heavy boxes. Without hesitation, Mason set his own chores aside, walked over, and helped carry every box onto the neighbor's porch. They thanked him with the familiarity of people who had known him for years. No fear, no hesitation, only gratitude. As he returned to the house, I noticed the sleeves of his sweatshirt had slipped back slightly, revealing faded paint stains instead of anything dramatic. They looked like the marks of someone constantly fixing fences, repairing walls, or helping with home projects. Suddenly, dozens of little moments from school began connecting inside my head. The groceries, the library, the bus stop, the notebooks. Every quiet act had been dismissed because it did not fit the story everyone preferred to believe. I turned away before Mason could notice me and continued walking home beneath the streetlights. For the first time since all of this had begun, I realized I was no longer searching for the reason he waited for me every afternoon. I was searching for the reason someone so quietly kind had become the loneliest person in our entire school. Monday arrived with clear skies and the kind of crisp autumn air that made the entire campus feel brighter than usual, but something inside me had changed over the weekend. I could no longer pretend Mason Brooks was simply the mysterious student everyone warned me about. Every quiet moment I had witnessed outside of school had rewritten the picture I carried in my head. Still, I had no explanation for why he continued walking behind me every afternoon. That unanswered question lingered in my thoughts through every class until dismissal finally came. As expected, Mason stood near the front gate, hands resting inside the pockets of his dark jacket, his attention focused on the street instead of the crowd. I walked past him, and several seconds later I heard the familiar rhythm of footsteps following at the same respectful distance. This time, however, I did not feel nervous. I felt curious. Halfway home, I stopped at a neighborhood bakery to buy fresh bread for my mother. The line moved slowly, and by the time I stepped back outside, the sidewalk had become noticeably quieter. As I adjusted the paper bag beneath my arm, I noticed 3 older students from another school standing near the entrance to the parking lot. One of them smiled in a way that immediately made me uncomfortable. They casually stepped into the narrow walkway, blocking the easiest path toward the sidewalk. One asked whether I had a few dollars to spare. Another joked that I looked like someone who never said no to anybody. Their words sounded playful, but something about the situation felt wrong. I politely explained that I needed to get home and tried to walk around them. They shifted just enough to remain in front of me, laughing among themselves. My heart began beating faster, not because anyone had threatened me, but because I suddenly realized how isolated the street had become. Before I could think of what to say next, another voice calmly entered the conversation. He said he needs to go home. The words were quiet, almost gentle, yet every person turned toward the speaker immediately. Mason stood several feet away with the same calm expression he always wore. He did not raise his voice. He did not move closer than necessary. He simply looked at the group with steady confidence. An awkward silence settled over the sidewalk. One of the older students shrugged and forced an uneasy laugh before stepping aside. The others exchanged uncertain glances, then followed without another word. Within seconds, they had continued down the street as though nothing had happened. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. Mason glanced toward me only long enough to make sure the path was clear. "You should not miss dinner," he said quietly. It was the first time I had ever heard him speak directly to me. His voice was softer than I expected, carrying none of the harshness people always associated with him. Before I could answer, he resumed walking several steps behind me exactly as he had every afternoon before. The silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt intentional, almost protective. When I reached my front porch, I turned around. Before unlocking the door, Mason had already stopped beneath the familiar maple tree. Gathering more courage than I knew I had, I called out, "Thank you." For a brief second, surprise crossed his face. Then, almost too quickly to notice, the smallest smile appeared. It was not dramatic or triumphant. It was simply the expression of someone who had finally heard words he never expected to receive. Without saying anything else, he gave a quiet nod, turned toward the fading evening sunlight, and walked away, leaving me standing on my porch with the unmistakable feeling that the distance between us had become just a little smaller. The following afternoon, I left school expecting the familiar routine, but instead of walking straight toward home, I stopped beneath the large oak tree near the front entrance and waited. Students streamed around me in every direction, laughing, talking about homework, weekend plans, and the upcoming football game. Mason remained by the brick wall as always, watching the street rather than the crowd. For the first time since all of this had begun, I walked directly toward him instead of past him. He looked genuinely surprised when I stopped a few feet away. "Would you walk beside me today?" I asked quietly. For several seconds, he simply stared at me, almost as though he was making sure he had heard correctly. Then he gave a small nod. We began walking together without another word. It felt strangely natural, even though the silence between us carried weeks of unanswered questions. After several blocks, I finally gathered enough courage to ask the one thing I had wanted to know since the first afternoon. "Why me?" Mason lowered his eyes toward the sidewalk. His expression grew thoughtful, almost hesitant. "You really do not remember," he said softly. I frowned. "Remember what?" He smiled, but there was sadness behind it. 7 years ago, Lincoln Community Center. The word struck something deep inside my memory. I slowed my steps as faded images slowly returned. Every summer, my mother volunteered at the community center, and I often spent afternoons there reading while younger children attended programs. One rainy day, I remembered seeing a quiet boy sitting alone on the back steps after everyone else had gone inside. His clothes had been soaked from the storm, and several older kids had laughed at him earlier because he rarely spoke to anyone. I had walked outside carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate from the snack room. Without asking questions, I had handed one to him and sat beside him beneath the small awning while the rain continued falling. We had barely spoken. I remembered telling him that sometimes people decided who you were before they actually met you. I had said that it was unfair, but someday someone would notice the difference. After a few minutes, my mother called me inside, and I waved goodbye before leaving. I had never seen the boy again. At least, that was what I had always believed. "That was you," I whispered. Mason nodded slowly. My grandmother had just become my guardian. Everything felt unfamiliar. I thought everyone already believed the worst about me. His voice remained calm, but every word carried years of quiet gratitude. You were the first person who sat next to me without asking what was wrong. You did not treat me like I was broken. You just shared your drink and your time. I searched his face, finally recognizing the younger version hidden beneath the years. The lonely eyes had never changed. I cannot believe I forgot, I admitted. You were just being kind, Mason replied. You probably forgot before summer ended. He looked toward the road ahead as fallen leaves drifted across the sidewalk. I never did. My chest tightened with emotions I could not easily explain. All this time, I had believed Mason was carrying some mysterious secret, when in reality, he had simply been protecting a memory that had quietly shaped his life. He took one slow breath before continuing. When I saw your name on the class list this year, I promised myself I would make sure you always made it home safely. Not because you needed someone to protect you, because 7 years ago you protected something inside me that I thought was already gone. Neither of us spoke again for the rest of the walk, but for the first time, there was no distance between us at all. The morning after our conversation, something subtle had changed between us, although neither of us acknowledged it out loud. Mason no longer waited across the street or several yards behind me. He still respected my space, but now we exchanged a quiet smile before classes began and another when the final bell rang. It was enough to make the rumors spread even faster. Students who had ignored me for years suddenly seemed fascinated by where I walked after school and who stood beside me at dismissal. Some whispered as we passed through the hallway. Others stopped talking altogether whenever Mason appeared. I began noticing something I had overlooked before. Fear was contagious, but so was curiosity. Every day, a few more people looked at Mason with uncertainty instead of suspicion. They were beginning to question the stories they had accepted for years. Not everyone welcomed that change. One Thursday afternoon, our principal made an announcement over the intercom asking Mason to report to the administrative office immediately after fourth period. The classroom fell completely silent. Several students exchanged knowing glances as if they had been expecting bad news all along. Noah leaned toward me and whispered that someone had filed another complaint about Mason making students uncomfortable simply by waiting outside after school. There had been no accusation of threats or inappropriate behavior, just anonymous reports claiming his presence frightened people. I stared at the front of the classroom, unable to focus on the lesson. By lunch, the entire school seemed convinced Mason would finally be suspended. The rumors grew larger with every passing hour. Some students claimed they had witnessed confrontations that never happened. Others repeated stories from years before without knowing whether any of them were true. Listening to them felt strangely painful because I now knew the person they described did not exist. When the final bell rang, I walked toward the main office instead of the front gate. Through the glass window, I saw Mason sitting quietly outside the principal's office, his backpack resting neatly beside his chair. He did not look angry or defensive. He simply looked tired, as though he had experienced this conversation too many times before. Before I had time to think twice, the office door opened, and the principal invited him inside. I remained in the hallway, my heart pounding harder with every passing minute. Nearly half an hour later, the door opened again. Mason stepped into the hallway carrying the same calm expression, but I noticed a folded paper in his hand. He looked at me with quiet surprise. "Everything is fine," he said gently. "They just asked me not to wait near the front entrance anymore, because some parents are concerned." He smiled as though he was trying to comfort me instead of himself. I understand. Something inside me refused to accept that answer. Before Mason could leave, I politely asked the school secretary whether I could speak with the principal for a moment. A few minutes later, I found myself sitting across from his desk, my palms damp with nervousness. I explained everything I had witnessed over the past several weeks. I told him about the library, the groceries, the elderly neighbor, the afternoon outside the bakery, and the reason Mason had been walking home with me. I admitted that I had believed the rumors too, until I actually paid attention to the person standing behind them. The principal listened without interrupting. When I finally finished, he remained quiet for several moments before looking toward the office window where Mason stood waiting outside. "Sometimes," he said thoughtfully, "the hardest reputation to change is one that was never earned in the first place." As I stepped back into the hallway, Mason looked at me with confused eyes, unaware of everything I had just shared. For the first time since we had met again, I realized protecting someone did not always mean standing in front of them. Sometimes it simply meant telling the truth when everyone else had grown comfortable believing something easier. The next morning, the atmosphere at Westbrook High felt different in a way that could not be measured or explained. The rumors had not disappeared overnight, but they no longer sounded as certain as they once had. Questions had quietly replaced assumptions. I noticed students watching Mason with thoughtful expressions instead of immediate fear. A few even nodded politely as they passed him in the hallway. He acknowledged each greeting with the same quiet respect before continuing on his way, never drawing attention to himself. During lunch, Noah slid into the seat across from me with an embarrassed smile. "I think I judged him too quickly," he admitted. "Yesterday I saw him helping Coach Reynolds organize equipment after practice. Nobody asked him to do it." I smiled because I knew exactly what he meant. Once you stopped listening to the stories and started watching Mason himself, the truth became impossible to ignore. That afternoon, I packed my books more slowly than usual. Ever since the meeting with the principal, I had expected something to change, although I did not know what. When the final bell echoed through the building, students rushed toward the exits, filling the hallways with their usual excitement. I walked through the front entrance and instinctively looked toward the familiar brick wall. It was empty. My eyes searched the sidewalk, the parking lot, the old maple tree across the street, but Mason was nowhere to be seen. A strange disappointment settled over me. I reminded myself that the principal had asked him not to wait there anymore. He was simply respecting the school's request. Even so, the walk home felt unusually quiet. Every familiar corner reminded me of footsteps that were no longer there. I reached the bakery where we had spoken for the first time. Nothing. I crossed Maple Street where he had always stopped behind me. Still nothing. By the time I reached my neighborhood, the silence had become heavier than I expected. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and immediately realized something was missing. For weeks, I had unconsciously measured every afternoon by the certainty that someone was making sure I arrived home safely. Without that quiet presence, the street outside seemed strangely empty. The following day, I made a decision before school even started. Instead of waiting to see whether Mason would appear after classes, I would find him myself. When the final bell rang, I hurried through the crowded hallway toward the library, then the cafeteria, then the gymnasium. He was nowhere. I checked the student parking lot, and finally the bus stop near the football field. Still nothing. Just as I began wondering whether he had already left campus, I noticed a familiar dark jacket near the community volunteer garden behind the school. Mason was kneeling beside a row of flowers, carefully helping an elderly groundskeeper gather fallen branches after the previous night's storm. He looked up as my footsteps approached. Genuine surprise crossed his face. "Ethan," he asked softly, "I have been looking everywhere for you." I replied, slightly out of breath. He stood slowly, brushing dirt from his gloves. "I did not want to cause more problems for you or the school," he explained. "So I thought it would be better if I stopped waiting." I looked directly into his eyes and smiled. "Then do not wait anymore." He blinked in confusion. I stepped closer and continued. "From now on, we leave together." For a long moment, he simply stared at me, as though those words belonged to a future he had never allowed himself to imagine. Then the same quiet smile I had seen only once before slowly returned, brighter than the autumn sunlight filtering through the trees, and together we began walking toward the front gate side by side, neither of us walking ahead, neither of us following behind. The weeks that followed did not transform everything overnight, but they changed enough to remind me that real change rarely arrived all at once. It arrived one conversation at a time, one honest moment at a time, one person choosing to look again instead of looking away. Mason and I continued leaving school together every afternoon. Sometimes we talked about classes, favorite books, or the best pie sold at the little bakery on Maple Street. Other days we simply enjoyed the quiet walk home, comfortable enough to let silence say everything words did not need to. Somewhere along the way, people stopped staring so much. They realized there was nothing mysterious about two classmates sharing the same sidewalk. Coach Reynolds eventually invited Mason to help with the school's community volunteer program because he had already been assisting around campus without expecting recognition. The librarian convinced him to join the student reading club after discovering how many novels he had quietly borrowed throughout the year. Even Noah began walking with us once or twice each week, laughing at how completely wrong his first impression had been. The greatest change, however, happened inside Mason himself. The cautious distance he had carried for years slowly disappeared. He smiled more often. He answered questions in class without immediately lowering his eyes afterward. Teachers began praising his work openly, and for the first time, his classmates actually listened instead of whispering. One Friday afternoon near the end of the semester, our English teacher assigned a presentation about someone who had changed the way we viewed the world. Many students chose famous inventors, athletes, or historical leaders. I chose someone sitting 3 desks behind me. When my turn arrived, I stood in front of the classroom with shaking hands and told everyone that the most important lesson I had learned all year was that rumors could build walls much faster than truth could tear them down. I spoke about judging people without understanding their story. I spoke about quiet kindness that often went unnoticed because it was never performed for applause. I never repeated the cruel stories that had followed Mason for years. They no longer deserved another audience. When I finished, the room remained silent for several long seconds before our teacher thanked me with a thoughtful smile. As I returned to my seat, I glanced toward Mason. His eyes were bright with emotion, and although he did not say anything, he gave me the same grateful nod I remembered from my front porch months earlier. On the last day of school before winter break, snowflakes drifted gently across the front lawn as students hurried toward buses and waiting cars. The brick wall where Mason had once stood alone was almost hidden beneath a thin layer of fresh snow. We paused there together for a moment. "You know," I said with a smile, "you do not have to make sure I get home anymore." Mason looked at me with the same calm expression that had once seemed impossible to understand. "I know," he answered. "Then why are you still coming?" He laughed quietly, the sound light enough to disappear into the cold afternoon air. "Because now I am not walking you home." He looked down the familiar sidewalk stretching toward our neighborhood before meeting my eyes again. "Now we are just walking home together." We stepped forward side by side, leaving 2 sets of footprints across the fresh snow instead of one leading behind the other. Looking back now, I understand that the person everyone believed they should fear was never waiting because he wanted to be noticed. He was waiting because years earlier, one small act of kindness had given him hope when he needed it most. In the end, I did not change Mason's life by saving him. He changed mine by reminding me that the strongest hearts are often the quietest ones, and that sometimes the greatest courage is simply choosing to see the person standing behind the story.